After I released my video on how to set up the original Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera for filmmaking, I got a request to make a similar video for the Panasonic GH5. So here it is, how to set up your Panasonic GH5 for filmmaking. So before we set up our GH5 for filmmaking, make sure you're in the movie mode on the top dial. So let's go into the menu. And I have my camera set up to go to my menu by default, but we'll get to that later. So let's go to the first tab, the film camera with an M. And I'm not going to go through every single setting in this menu because that would take way too long and be honestly quite boring, but I've managed to select a few that I think are very important for filmmaking and are important to understand to get the most out of your camera. And first up we have exposure mode, and this I have set to M for manual. And if you're doing any type of filmmaking, I think it's very important to be in full control of your exposure, and therefore I always leave it at manual. And next up we have variable frame rate, and this is for fast and slow motion. And it's only available in 8-bit, so if you're shooting in 10-bit, this option will be grayed out. And here you have the option of turning it off and on, and also setting your variable frame rate. If you're shooting in 4K, this goes up to 60 frames per second, but if you're shooting in 1080p, it goes up all the way to 180 frames per second. And as you can see here, we have a frame rate, but also a recording frame rate. And your recording frame rate is determined by your recording settings. So for example, this camera is currently set to 1080p 25 frames per second. So the camera will take that frame rate of 180 frames per second and slow that down to 25 frames per second, giving us a speed of 14%. But I typically don't use variable frame rate since I rarely go over 50 or 60 frames per second anyway, and in that case I'd rather use one of the 50 or 60p options and get a bit higher quality instead. For example, if you shoot in 1080p, you can get 50 or 60p in 10-bit. And next up we have shutter speed gain operation, and here I have it set to angle/ISO, and this will allow you to use shutter angle instead of shutter speed. Shutter speed is the standard for cinema and film cameras, and if you typically use double your frame rate as your shutter speed, for example using 1/50th of a second for 25 frames per second, then you're using what's called the 180-degree shutter rule. So by using shutter angle instead of shutter speed, no matter what frame rate you choose, if you use a 180-degree shutter, you will always be double your frame rate in terms of shutter speed. And next up we have waveform and vector scope. And I'll leave this setting off here in the menu, but later on in the video we'll actually program this function to a specific button on the camera. And our last option here in the first tab is our Vlog View Assist. And this is where you'll set up your Vlog viewing LUTs if you're shooting in Vlog. By default the camera comes with a Vlog to Rec 709 LUT already installed, and you can also load 4 more of your own LUTs into the camera. And if you want to use false color on your GH5, this is the setting that makes that possible, and I have a video about that which I'll link up in the top right corner right here. And that's the last setting in the first tab, so let's go to the second, which is just the standard film camera. And here we first have recording format. And for your recording format you have 5 different options: AVC HD, MP4, MP4 HEVC, which stands for High Efficiency Video Codec, MP4 LPCM, and MOV. If you want to be able to access the best quality recording settings, then you have to choose either MP4 LPCM or MOV in this setting. Which of the two you choose doesn't really matter that much, since they're both recording the same codec, it's just coming in a different container, either a .mp4 container or a .mov. But I have mine set to MP4 LPCM. And then next up we come to recording quality. And in this option you have different settings for recording quality, which will determine your resolution, your frame rate, your bit rate, your bit depth, and your chroma subsampling. For example, this first option here is 1080p at 25 frames per second, 100 megabits per second in 8-bit at 420 chroma subsampling. And some options are in long GOP and some other options are in all-I. And the difference between all-I and long GOP is the way it compresses the files. All-I compresses every single frame individually, which will make it much easier on your editing software to handle the files, but it will also make the files much bigger. If you want to maximize the image quality that comes out of your GH5, the highest quality options are 4K 10-bit, and you have this in long GOP and also all-I. The all-I option will give you much larger files, and you will also need a faster SD card since you're now shooting at 400 megabits per second, and that's 50 megabytes per second, so an SD card with a V30 rating won't be enough. You will need a card with a V60 rating or faster. So I stay at the long GOP option at 150 megabits instead. And a lot of the time I actually just shoot in 1080p, still at 10-bit, but the 1080p of this camera still uses the whole resolution and the whole width of the sensor and then just downscales to 1080p. And if you want to use variable frame rate, which I showed earlier, then you can see here that some of the options have VFR available. So if you're using one of the options without VFR available, you won't be able to access the variable frame rate in the settings. And I have 25p as an option since I live in Europe and shoot in PAL. But if you live in the US, for example, and shoot in NTSC, you'll have the option of 24 or 30 frames per second instead. So let's choose 4K 10-bit and go to the next option, and that is continuous AF, and I have that set to off. The continuous autofocus performance of the GH5 isn't really that great, so I wouldn't rely on it for filmmaking, and if you're using adapted lenses it will be even worse, and if you're using manual lenses then it won't even be an option. And next up we have our photo style, and I shoot in Vlog. But this won't be an option unless you buy the Vlog upgrade for the camera. Shooting in Vlog will give you a bit more dynamic range than the standard profiles. Vlog is rated at 12 stops compared to 10 stops for the standard profiles. And I also have my sharpness turned all the way down, since I already think the image from the GH5 is plenty sharp as it is. In my opinion, adding more digital sharpness to the image just makes it look more like video compared to film. But if you don't want to shoot in Vlog, you have a few other options as well. For example, you can actually shoot in Hybrid Log Gamma, which is HLG. HLG is only available when shooting in 10-bit, but it has very comparable dynamic range to Vlog. I do prefer using Vlog over HLG, but before I got Vlog I actually shot a full shorts documentary all in HLG. But if you don't want to shoot in HLG or Vlog, I would recommend using the natural profile. It would either be natural or Cine-like D, but I do prefer the look of skin tones in natural instead of Cine-like D. Cine-like D is the flattest profile if you exclude log, but I do think the skin tones look better in natural and the dynamic range isn't really that different. And you also have the option of customizing your profiles a bit more to your liking, by either turning up or down the contrast, the sharpness, the noise reduction, the saturation, or shifting the hue. But I'm gonna leave mine at Vlog. And next up we have luminance level. And if you're shooting in Vlog or HLG, this will be grayed out since that's already predetermined for you. But otherwise, if you're shooting in 10-bit, I would set it to 0 to 1023. And if you're in 8-bit, it would be 0 to 255. And next up we have our metering mode. And to be honest, I rarely use the meter in the camera, but I have it set for spot metering for those times that I actually do use the meter. I can put the spot on a gray card, for example. And next up we have stabilizer. And this is where you'll control the IBIS, the in-body image stabilization. And first up we have operation mode, which is where you will be able to choose to turn it off or on. And when using sublenses, also choose to only stabilize one axis. And after that we have E-stabilization, which I'll leave at off. I don't want the camera to do any electronic stabilization to the image, which also crops it. And after that we have IS lock, which is basically the IBIS mimicking a tripod. So if you want a really locked off shot, but you don't have a tripod at hand, then if you hold the camera very still and use IS lock, the camera will do a pretty good job. And if you're using anamorphic lenses, then you'll enter the squeeze factor here. But the last option of the stabilizer setting is focal length set. And this is where you'll enter your focal length if you're using manual lenses, since they won't transmit their focal length to the camera through the mount. And if you enter the setting, here you can enter the focal length of your lens, but you can also save 3 different presets for your most commonly used manual lenses. And as you can see, I actually have decimals entered for my focal lengths, and that's because if you're using a Speedbooster, you then have to multiply the crop factor of the Speedbooster to your focal length. And that's because the Speedbooster gives you a wider field of view. So if you're not multiplying the crop factor of the Speedbooster with the lens, then your camera won't be able to stabilize your image properly. So for example, a 35mm lens times the crop factor of my Speedbooster, which is 0.71, will give me a new focal length of 24.8. So if you want to save a focal length as one of your presets, then you first enter your focal length, tap one of the presets, and then press display to save. But I'm not gonna do that now. And that's the last option of the stabilizer menu. And next up we have some audio settings. I'll leave my mic level display to on, which will display my audio meters on the screen. Our mic level adjustment is where we'll set our mic gain, but we will program this to a button later on, so we don't have to go into the menu every single time we want to adjust our mic levels. And after mic levels we have mic level limiter, and if you're just using your camera for scratch audio, or if you have no control of the mic levels, then it could be nice to have the limiter on. But if you can control the levels and dial in your gain properly, then I would probably leave the limiter to off. And next up we have our HDMI recording output. And this is what determines what you send to an external monitor or recorder. If you want a clean HDMI output for external recording, then you want to turn info display off. And as you can see, I have my down convert set to 1080p, and that's because I found I got less input lag to my external monitor when using 1080p instead of 4K. If you're shooting in Vlog and using a viewing LUT HDMI display will allow you to send out LUT also to your external monitor. And if you're using an external recorder and want to be able to shoot in 4K 50 or 60p in 10-bit, just choose 422 10-bit instead. But when enabling this, you won't be able to record internally to the camera at the same time. And that's our last option in the movie settings. Let's go down to the custom wrench. And first, let's go to exposure. And first we want to set our ISO increments to 1/3. This will allow us to use ISO 500 or 640 for example, which are between the full stops 400 and 800. So let's skip a few pages and go down to function button set. And here you can set up custom functions to every button on your camera, but we'll get back to this later. And next up we have our quick menu, which I have set to custom. This will allow me to choose what settings show up in the quick menu, but we'll get to that later as well. Next up we have peaking. In peaking you can turn it off and on, and also set what peaking level you want. You can choose either high or low. I generally stick to low since I don't want too much peaking on my screen. I just want things that are actually in focus to be showing peaking. And you can also choose a peaking color of your liking. After that we have histogram, which I have left to on, but if you want to have more space available on your screen, you can turn the histogram off. And next up we have our guidelines, which will allow you to use a grid of your liking, for example a rule of thirds grid. And after that we have video guidelines, which will allow you to have aspect ratio markers on your screen. If we go down to the next screen, we'll have our zebra pattern, and here you can actually enter two different zebras, zebra 1 and zebra 2. You can set zebra 1 to 50% for example, and zebra 2 to 80%, and this is what I have for vlog. 50% is for skin tones and 80% is where vlog starts to clip. But if you're using one of the standard profiles, those numbers would be 60 to 65 and 100% instead. And if you want to be a bit safer when it comes to clipping, you can set zebra to 5% lower instead. And after zebras we have our video priority display, which you can have on or off. It doesn't really matter for the function of the camera, it just changes the layout of the screen a tiny bit. So let's go back out to the full menu and go to our fourth tab, the wrench. And first up we have custom set memory, and this is where you'll save your current settings to a custom mode on the top tile of the camera, but we'll get back to this in a bit. After that we have Wi-Fi, which you can use to control the camera through the image app. And after that we have beep, which I have turned off completely. I don't want my camera to beep or make any sound at all for that matter. After that we have live view mode, which I have left at 60 frames per second. But if you want to save some battery life, you can choose 30 frames per second instead. Now let's go down till we get to system frequency. And I have mine set to 50 Hz, which is PAL, and that's because I live in Europe. But if you live in the US for example, then you want to be using NTSC, which is 59.97 Hz. But if you want to shoot in true 24 frames per second, that's 24.00, then you have the option of using 24.00 Hz here as well, which is the cinema standard. But I'll leave mine at 50 Hz. Next up we have our double slot function, and this determines what the camera does with the dual card slots. You have the option of choosing relay record, which means when one card is full it will switch to the other, and then you can actually hot swap the cards and basically record forever, as long as you can provide power to the camera. And your next option is using backup record, which will record the same file to both cards, giving you an instant backup of your files. This can be a very powerful option if you're shooting a wedding for example. We just can't afford to lose files. This will give you an instant backup of the files, so if one card goes down you still have all the files intact on a separate SD card. And the third option is using allocation recording, which will send photos to one card and video to the other. But for now I'll leave mine at relay recording. And our last option is format. This one is pretty obvious. It will format your SD cards. And that's the last setting of the wrench tab. After that we have My Menu. And in My Menu you can gather all the settings you use the most, so you don't have to dive into the full menu looking for them every single time. And to add settings to your My Menu, you simply go to My Menu Settings, click Add, and select the setting you want to add to your My Menu. But I'll quickly show you which settings I have added to my Menu. On the second page I have these settings. And on my first page I have these. These are the settings I access the most, so having them all in one place saves me so much time when shooting. And that wraps it up for the menu. So let's go out of the menu and look at programming some custom functions to your buttons on the camera. To set up custom functions to the buttons on the GH5, you actually don't even have to enter the menu. All you do is hold down the button you want to program and then choose the function you want that button to have. For example, I have function button 4 set to stabilizer. So if I press the button here, then I get the option of turning the IBIS on or off. And if I hit display, I can now enter my focal length for using manual lenses. And it's not just the buttons marked as FN and then a number. You can actually program any of the buttons to do a specific task. For example, I have the left scroll wheel to toggle focus peaking to low, high, and then off. Down on the control wheel toggles my waveform and vector scopes. Pressing right turns off the zebra, zebra 1, zebra 2, and then back to off. And then if I press up, that brings up my audio levels, so I can dial in the correct gain for my specific scene. And my function button 3 is set to the Vlog View Assist. And if I'm using an external monitor, I can just hold the button down and then change it to the HDMI display LUT instead. So by pressing the button, I then get the option to turn the LUT for my external monitor on and off. Function button 2 I have left to the default, which is the quick menu. But as I said earlier, I have my quick menu set to custom, so I can choose which options show up in the quick menu. These 5 are all the options I choose to have in my quick menu. I have my photo style, which I have currently set to Vlog. If I'm using variable frame rate, I can access that straight through the quick menu. I have my aspect ratio guides, my recording quality. For example, if I want to change from 4K to 1080p, I can do that very quickly. And now we're in 1080p 10-bit instead. And then the last option I had in my quick menu is the metering mode. And the function button 5 here on the left side, I haven't done anything to. I left it at a default to toggle between the viewfinder, the LCD screen, and auto. And now let's look at the buttons on top of the camera. And here we have function button 1, which I have set to the X teleconverter, which allows me to get a bit more reach out of my lenses when in a pinch. And we also have a button located on the front of the camera, right about here, which I have set to the IS lock function. So by just tapping that button I can toggle IS lock on or off, which will allow me to get very steady shots. And on top of the camera we also have our mode dial. And here you can see we have C1, C2 and C3. And those are the custom modes that you can program through the custom set memory function that I mentioned earlier in the menu. So if you want to be able to quickly access specific settings, like shooting in 120 frames per second for example, then you can actually save those settings to one of the C1, C2 or C3 modes. So all you have to do to get to 120 frames per second is then turn the dial to C1 for example. So when you want to shoot in 120 frames per second, all you have to do is turn the dial. So to set it up, first make sure you're in the movie mode on the top dial. And once you've done that, it's time to set up the camera the way you want it to be saved to the custom mode. So let's use shooting in 120 frames per second as an example. So we're currently shooting in 1080p 10-bit, but variable frame rate isn't available when shooting in 10 bits, so we have to change that. So let's go into the menu and choose recording quality. Let's choose Full HD 8-bit. As we can see now, we have the option of choosing our variable frame rate. Let's go to set and set it to 120 frames per second. And since I'm using my camera in the PAL setting, I don't have 120 frames per second as an option. I have 100 or 125, but let's just choose 125 for this example. And now let's go to the fourth tab, the wrench menu, and on the first page we have our custom set memory. And here we can choose C1, C2, C3.1, 3.2 and 3.3. And if I choose C1, then I'll overwrite my current settings on the C1 setting and then instead save 120 frames per second to custom 1. And once that's saved, I can change my settings back to my original settings, and all I have to do to get to 120 frames per second is turn the dial to C1. I have a bunch of different resolutions and frame rates set to my custom modes, but to be honest, I rarely use it anymore. And that's because it doesn't just save your resolution and frame rate, it saves almost all your settings. So for example, the white balance and the photo style you had set at that current time will also be saved in the custom mode. And since I rarely use anything higher than 50 or 60 FPS anyway, my way of just changing the frame rate or resolution is going into my quick menu and then simply changing it from, let's say, Full HD 10-bit to 4K 10-bit. And that's done. Now all my other settings are still the same as they were before. And that's how I set up my Panasonic GH5 for filmmaking. If you have any other requests for videos, please let me know down in the comments below. But that wraps it up for this video. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see some more, and I'll see you next time.